Chris Mannix, NBC Sports Radio, The Vertical. Listen to the Mannix podcast, and he joins us now to talk some NBA as the Celtics, Chris, with a big win last night, but the game was in Boston. Shouldn't we have expected that to go that way?
Yeah, the home teams have really controlled this series in a remarkable way. The margin of victory is an average of 18 points. All these games have ended in double-digit wins by the home team. It's just, I don't think it's hard to explain because Washington was a sub-500 team during the regular season, a great team at home, and the regular season matches between these two teams were also won by the home teams. But it's just been a little bit surprising just how wide the gap in the scores have been. It's like these teams are kind of Jekyll and Hyde based on where they're playing these games. And, obviously if Washington's going to have any chance of winning this series, they've got to find a way to put together a win in Boston.
Yeah, no doubt. What was the story last night? I mean, it looked like, Chris, it was pretty much done from the, the opening tap. I mean, Boston jumped out on like many. It hasn't happened that way. Washington has kind of dominated the series, but hadn't had much to show for it. But last night was a different story.
Yeah, I mean, look, going into last night's game, they had led for, I think, 70% of the series. I mean, they've been victimized by Isaiah Thomas in games 1 and 2, particularly that 53-point outburst in game 2. But they had played pretty well. But, early on, those jump shots that were falling for them in games 3 and 4 just stopped falling. And in Washington, they're a confidence-playing team. And when they get down on the road, that confidence wanes considerably, and they just look like an entirely different team out there. I mean, Markieff Morris was an impactful player for this team in games 3 and 4. He was really nowhere to be found in that game. And look, I wrote this last night that we'll talk about the stars a lot during the series, but the bottom line is it's the role players. It's the Avery Bradleys who played great. It's the Morrises and the Marcin Gortats who did not play well for Washington last night. Those are the players that are going to decide this series because you know what you're going to get largely from your stars. You don't really know, at least you haven't known this series, what you're going to get from everybody else.
Yeah, Bradley, 25 in the first half. He was unconscious. Had an awesome game last night. Chris Mannix from The Vertical, NBC Sports Radio. Chris, do you expect to be at the Garden again for Game 7?
Yeah, you got to kind of project forward and say that, the way that this series has gone, the home team rallies and plays better. And I think this is where having a coach like Scott Brooks is really valuable for a team like the Wizards. Scott has coached in, dozens of playoff games in his career, been in series where he's had his back against the wall. This team was down 0-2, and Scott pushed the right buttons, got them back in it there. So I don't think they're done by any stretch. And as we talked about, they have been in control for much of this series. I think it's perfectly reasonable to think they'll rally, win Game 6, but can they win a Game 7 in Boston? That much is just a little bit harder to predict.
All right, tonight, Harden, no problem with San Antonio, it seemed like, for much of the game. But in the second half and overtime, no Harden to be found, which puts them on the brink of elimination. So give me your feel for Houston Spurs tonight, which, could eliminate these Rockets.
Well, again, it depends on Kawhi Leonard and what he can do. The injury that he sustained in the last game, if he's hampered or unable to play for any reason, obviously that's a game changer for the Spurs. They've done a tremendous job surviving the loss of Tony Parker, but the loss of Kawhi Leonard or any limitations on Kawhi Leonard, I would think that's unsurvivable. I think Mike D'Antoni, too, has got to do a better job of getting a guy like James Harden rest late in games. Harden looked totally gassed at the end of Game 5. Just didn't have anything left in the tank, and I think that's largely because Mike's played him a lot of minutes this postseason, and he's not playing a lot of guys, playing about 7 deep on his roster right now. I think he's got to find ways to get James Harden rest in the second and third quarters so he's a fresher player coming forth.
Chris, obviously, most people are watching these two series with the anticipation that neither one of them has a shot in the next round. Does either one of them have a shot in the next round?
No, I guess anything could happen, but I don't see it. The way that Cleveland's playing right now, they're rolling, and the way that San Antonio is playing right now, there's just an inevitability to a third straight finals matchup between these two teams. And then the question becomes, how many years in a row are we going to get this? I really don't think there's a team out there that can close the gap with either of these two teams next year. And you might even look a year beyond that before you have to start really thinking about when we won't get a Warriors and a Cavaliers final. I mean, the gap between these two teams and everybody else, it's pretty significant. And I think it's going to be significant for a little while longer.
Chris Mannix, NBC Sports Radio, The Vertical, NBA. Some NBA news here locally. Keith Pompey from The Inquirer reporting the Sixers could make a lucrative offer for Kyle Lowry. Obviously, the ties are there. We can all connect the dots. But is this the right time, and is he the right guy for the Sixers to go after?
Well, I think he's the right guy. I'm extremely skeptical that he'd want to go there. I mean, Kyle Lowry, there's two things that matter to him right now. One is getting a enormous contract and getting paid. He was given a below-market value contract the last time around. He's looking to score on the new one this time, and the Raptors, they can offer him the most money. And if it's not Toronto, at 31 years old, he has said he wants to find a place to win, and that could mean a spot like San Antonio or another Western Conference team. I just don't see Kyle Lowry, despite the obvious ties to the Philadelphia area because of college. I don't see him wanting to go and play for a team that's on the rebuild.
Not to mention Colangelo as well, who drafted him. But would he be a good fit for the Sixers? I mean, maybe not for him in his timeline, but would he be a guy who would validate where the Sixers are and make them a legitimate, playoff consideration?
Maybe. But there's a lot of other questions that go unanswered. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Ben Simmons playing the one. What happens to that if Kyle Lowry's there? I think he's a good guy and a veteran player. He'd obviously make them a lot better. But for a team that is nowhere near contention, I'm not so sure that spending a whole bunch of money on a point guard who's not going to be, I don't want to say he's not going to be very good, but he's going to be limited in the back end of that contract. I'm not so sure that's the way to go for Philly.
All right, wrapping things up, Kevin Durant told a lot of the top prospects, skip the Combine, not worth it. I know here locally the Combine has been like the rite of passage for the last couple of years. But what do you think about the NBA players jumping out? Because we do see some of the top guys there. Some of the top guys decide not to go.
Yeah, look, the top guys, the exodus began a couple of years ago. It's not going to come back. I mean, guys used to just go up and do some of the testing. Now they're not doing it at all. They're either no-showing completely or going there and only going through the interview process. The Combine has basically become what the Portsmouth Invitational it has been the last few years, which is an exhibition for fringe prospects and maybe some back end to the middle of the first-round pack. I don't ever foresee the day where we're going to see all the elite players participate in the NBA draft. Never again. I get where Kevin Durant's coming from, that there's not always a lot to gain from guys going there, especially, I mean, look at a guy like Rudy Gobert, who went to the Combine a few years ago, stunk up the joint, just didn't test well athletically. He fell all the way down to 27th that year in the draft. He's clearly better than the 27th best player. There's too much to lose for some guys and not enough to gain by going to the Combine.
All right, Chris Mannix, NBC Sports Radio. Listen to him there online, NBCSportsRadio.com, and check him out on the Vertical podcast, the Mannix podcast, and at Chris Mannix, YS, on Twitter. Chris, enjoy the games tonight, pal.
You got to take